Welcome, Nipsing students. What's up? I hope you're having a good day. And this is the final textbook chapter for this term, chapter 7. The fifth quiz will be associated with this. The fifth quiz is ready. It's going to be, by the time you're hearing this, it will be out. In this chapter, what I want to do is kind of talk about this idea of the nature side of what happens in adolescence. And this will be a little bit shorter of a presentation. And part of that's because I understand where you're at this point in the term and how time is of the essence. And so what I'm going to actually try to do today is do something a little more close to what you're doing in some of your assignments. And instead of being kind of ranty and rambly like usual, I'm going to try to give a more concise, focused. So I'm not just like skimping out and doing a short presentation. What I'm actually going to try to do is do a more focused, hour and a half, I'm not sure how long this is going to go, and just really talk about this idea of how these early physical, hormonal, and cognitive changes that happen in adolescence set the foundation for some of these shifts and transformations of things like identity and self-concept and these kind of ideas that we're going to start really getting into at a deep level when we start the second portion of this course for those of you that are taking it in the new year. Okay, so this is kind of this is kind of the cutoff point. We're sort of transitioning, and I kind of thought this would be a cool way to do this is, since the teen years are the transition between early life and adulthood, that kind of using them as, we talk about physical, cognitive at each stage, then the social and emotional. And so we're using this as sort of the break point, and then it's going to give me a good kind of starting point for the next course. So I think you all get that. Okay, so anyways, Mike, stay focused, concise. I'm going to try to rein in the rambling a bit. All right, next slide. This is a video to kind of set the tone.
Being a teen can be an amazing time of discovery, learning, and friendship, but it's also a time of rapid change and emotional highs and lows where things can feel really tough. So, what's going on in our brains and bodies that make us feel this way? Why is being a teen so hard? We're often told that the most important years of brain development are between 0 and 5 years old, although recent research has found adolescent development to be equally important. During childhood, our brains continually grow, generating gray matter until they reach their maximum size, which for girls is around age 12 and boys around age 14. But even after this, the brain works to become more efficient by cutting away unused gray matter that isn't exercised by experience, and at the same time increasing myelin, which is fatty tissue that insulates brain pathways. Puberty begins in the hypothalamus, where a protein called kisspeptin is produced, triggering the pituitary gland to unleash the hormones testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. These activate the ovaries and testes, but also cause you to seek emotionally charged experiences, whether it's a movie to make you sob or driving 180 kilometers per hour down the freeway. It causes your response to emotionally loaded images or sounds to be more intense, which is why listening to One Direction may produce large bouts of the feels. The area of the brain responsible for planning ahead and assessing risk is still immature in teenagers, which is why teens are more likely to participate in high-risk behavior like unprotected sex and drinking and driving. Interestingly, in a simulated driving experience, adults and teens took the same amount of driving risks while alone. However, when surrounded by an audience of friends, teens took significantly more risks while adults were unaffected. What's the benefit of this behavior? Peer acceptance. In a study where teens were asked to rank music clips with and without knowing what their peers had picked, their choices changed. Unlike small children and adults, feeling socially isolated as a teen creates feelings of intense unworthiness. This, along with our biology, can contribute to teens prioritizing friends over even family. As social animals, stepping outside the safety of our family creates genetically diverse populations, diminishing the likeliness of inbreeding. In fact, teens have heightened social abilities like processing and evaluating facial expressions better than other age groups, allowing teens to be extremely cognizant of friends' joy, sadness, or stress. Speaking of stress, the hormone released in stressful situations to help soothe the brain cells of children and adults has the opposite impact on teens, causing an increase in anxiety. Pair that with a change in circadian rhythms, making you want to wake up 3 to 4 hours later than adults, it's no wonder some people describe teens as emotionally moody. On the other hand, teens are very physically healthy. The immune system is highly functioning, teens have increased tolerance to temperature changes, and a high resistance to cancer. But despite physical fitness, records show that death rates increase by 200 to 300% after childhood due to motor vehicle accidents, homicide, and suicide. Scientists believe that many changes in white matter, gray matter, and connections in the brain may be to blame, with an increased risk of errors during this time. But with a greater number of synaptic connections and increased plasticity, the teenage brain is primed to learn quickly and memorize content fast. Unlike an older brain rooted in what it knows, teens can respond easily to their environment and make incredible strides in communication and socialization. Not to mention, being passionate is incredibly valuable, and taking risks is often what is needed to make changes in your life and the lives of others. Being a teen can be tough, but it can also be amazing. If you want to know why teens are the biggest super fans and become obsessed with their favorite bands and shows, check out our latest ASAP thought on the science of fandom. Links are in the description to see that video.
So I want to talk about this for a sec, because think of Stanley G. Hall as the guy that early in the course we talked about him as an early psychologist that had this idea of norms, right? That it's normal for a kid to start talking at a certain time or start walking at a certain time, and that we can find these averages of when kids do that and call those norms. And this idea of norms was a really big idea, or another way of thinking of norms is this idea of milestones, and that concept was a big idea in child psychology for a long time. And what I would like you to please have in your notes is this idea of, he was talking about this concept of storms and stress. He's like, if you want 2 words to understand adolescence, storms and stress. And just think about that for a sec. It's like he said that in 1904. And it's like, if you're still a teenager now yourself, or were recently a teenager, it's like, it kind of feels like that at times. It's a storm of all these different complexities and the stress associated with that. It says here, adolescence is when the worst and the best impulses in the human soul struggle against each other for possession. It's a kind of dramatic way of saying it, and I elbowed my computer there trying to be dramatic, so I hope that didn't catch in the mic, but that's actually quite a good quote. All right, next slide. So one of the big concepts I want to focus on today is this idea of viewing puberty as a neuroendocrine process. Okay, so what that means is the endocrine system is associated with things like hormones and the adrenal glands and all these different glands. That the pituitary gland is what we're going to be talking about more specifically today. These glands that you can think of these as storage locations that release these hormones, these messengers in the body. And I have a couple animation style videos that I want to show about that. All right, and that once this process starts, it kind of initiates these changes, and some of these changes are what we consider primary, so that's like the actual related to the actual sex organs and the female reproductive system, stuff like the growth of the penis and menstruation. And then secondary growth, which would be things like the voice deepening and stuff like that. And we see that these dramatic changes in both height and weight, and the timing of when that happens differs between boys and girls, where we see that there's actually a point where on average girls are a bit taller than boys, and then there's a point where boys overwhelm that. And I'm going to show you a kind of neat graph on that in just a sec.
The endocrine system is composed of 10 glands in different parts of the body. When the endocrine glands are stimulated, they produce molecules called hormones and release them into the vascular system. Hormones are like chemical messengers, transported by the blood to target cells. When it reaches a target cell, the hormone attaches itself to a specific receptor, which triggers a physiological process such as cell division. The production of many hormones is controlled by two small structures located at the base of the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is composed of nerve nuclei that control vital functions such as sleep. The hypothalamus also controls the pituitary gland, which is the main hormone-producing gland. The pituitary gland alone secretes 9 different hormones. Vasopressin, for example, regulates kidney functioning. Oxytocin causes contractions of the uterus during childbirth. Other pituitary hormones control skin pigmentation and bone growth. Together, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland produce a third of the body's hormones. They therefore have an effect on many physiological processes.
What are hormones? A hormone is a chemical messenger that is secreted or released into our bloodstream by specific organs known as glands. Hormones regulate or control many processes in our body, including blood glucose levels, water content in blood, general growth, and blood pressure, just to name a few. As an example, thyroxine, which is a hormone secreted by your thyroid gland, helps to regulate metabolism. In other lessons, you will learn about a few of these hormones in more detail. Several hormones are secreted by the pituitary gland, located right below the hypothalamus in your brain. Instructions are given by the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland according to current conditions in our body. The secreted hormones travel through the bloodstream to target organs where either a specific response is directly produced, or it stimulates or causes the target organ to secrete its own hormones. We can think of this like a post office system. Hormones, or post, must reach the correct target organs or addresses for the right response to occur. Feeling thirsty? When the hypothalamus detects low levels of water in blood, it signals or tells the pituitary gland to release a hormone called the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, into your bloodstream. ADH travels to your kidneys, in this case the target organ, and causes water to be absorbed, so urine becomes more concentrated and output is decreased. Drinking more water increases the water content in your blood, which then causes the hypothalamus to signal the pituitary gland to secrete less ADH. Less ADH means your kidneys will absorb less water, causing urine to become less concentrated and output is increased. Ever felt suddenly frightened? When threatened, the brain activates neurons that stimulate the adrenal gland located right above your kidneys to rapidly secrete adrenaline. Adrenaline then acts on your heart and lungs to increase heart rate and breathing rate. This, along with other physiological responses, is known as the fight or flight response and is activated very quickly. At the same time, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland to secrete the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which travels to the adrenal glands to secrete a hormone known as cortisol. Cortisol acts in target organs to allow the body to adapt long-term to stress. So to review, hormones are chemical messengers secreted by glands into the bloodstream and produce a specific response when they reach the target organ.
So early in adolescence, girls tend to, on average, outweigh boys, but by about age 14, boys begin to surpass girls, and it happens a little bit earlier with height too. And this growth spurt occurs approximately 2 years earlier for girls, so there is this earlier maturation, is how you would say it. After watching those last two videos, they focused on this idea of hormones. Okay, so if you can have this in your notes, that hormones are these chemicals that are secreted by the endocrine glands and then carried through the blood through the bloodstream by the blood. Okay, and they're what's sending these messages to the different organs to respond in certain ways. Okay, so they're these super important messenger transmitters. Okay, so there's this process called the HPG axis. Okay, so I'm going to just read a little bit about this, because if you break this down, this is looking at the relationship between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the gonads. And I'm going to show a video in a sec that's a cool animation that looks at the same thing, but instead of looking at the gonads or the sex organs, it's looking at how that relates to the adrenal glands. But it just is an interesting animation showing this relationship between this the hypothalamus, or this area in the brain that is basically the command center sending this signal to the pituitary gland, and how it sends it to the pituitary gland is through this biosecretion, or biochemically. And then the pituitary gland signals through the release of these hormones, these messages to the gonads, right? So the gonads are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. Okay, so the hypothalamus is a structure in the brain that monitors eating and sex, and other things too, a lot of biorhythms. Increased release of the hypothalamic hormone stimulates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is an important endocrine gland that controls growth and regulates other glands by releasing its own hormones. So the pituitary gland is like super interesting and important because not only does it do certain things, it also does a lot of things that get other glands to do things. So it has this like really core role. So I'll just read that part again. The pituitary gland is an important endocrine gland that controls growth and regulates other glands by releasing its own hormones. The gonads, which is a collective term that means both the testes in males and the ovaries in females, releases testosterone and estrogen, hormones that are particularly important in giving rise to pubertal changes in the body. I don't know why I struggle with that word. Puberty-related changes in the body. The concentration of certain hormones increases dramatically during adolescence. Testosterone and estradiol, which is a type of estrogen, are present in the hormonal makeup of both boys and girls. However, where testosterone is associated with the development of the genitals, an increase in height, a change in voice in boys, estradiol is associated with breast, uterine, and skeletal development in girls. So there's this really interesting, so the kind of idea I want to just say about hormones that's really interesting is, think of them as biological messengers that carry specific information, and the type of information is so important because it's procedural information. Which is why it's so super complex, and just because we can put words to it, it's so complex that the hypothalamus, this part of your brain, sends a message to the pituitary gland that sends this other message that then initiates this whole process that we call puberty. You can see why someone like Freud would say that it seems like it's genetically pre-programmed.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the HPA axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis is best known for its role in our body's reaction to stress. The HPA axis includes a group of hormone-secreting glands from the nervous and endocrine systems, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. The hypothalamus is a small neuroendocrine structure situated just above the brainstem that controls the release of hormones from the pituitary gland, a hormone-secreting gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland can release hormones into the bloodstream to reach a variety of targets. In the case of the HPA axis, hormones released from the pituitary gland travel down to the kidneys and influence the secretion of hormones from endocrine glands called the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. The primary function of the HPA axis is to regulate the stress response. When we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH signals the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, into the bloodstream. ACTH travels down to the adrenal glands where it prompts the release of a hormone called cortisol from the cortex or outer layer of the adrenal glands. The release of cortisol causes a number of changes that help the body to deal with stress. For example, it helps to mobilize energy like glucose, so the body has enough energy to cope with a prolonged stressor. When cortisol levels in the blood get high, this is sensed by receptors in areas of the brain like the hypothalamus and hippocampus, which leads to the shutting off of the stress response through what is known as a negative feedback mechanism.
So when we're talking about the female side of puberty, Monarchy is the term that's used to describe a girl's first menstruation or a woman's first menstruation that tends to come rather late in the pubertal cycle. Around the world, the average age for Monarchy has declined significantly since the mid-19th century, likely the result of improvements in nutrition and improvements in health causing a reduction of malnutrition, which is sort of just saying the same thing. So it tends to come rather late in the pubertal cycle. Body weight seems to really affect it. So low body weight can delay it. Obesity can trigger it early. Stress can also be heavily affected by it. There's also some interesting research that says single parent families can also, being raised in that scenario can also have an effect on it, which also may just be another way of saying that stress affects it. Adolescents preoccupied with their bodies can develop images of what their bodies are like. We're going to talk about this idea of how body image is this thing that starts really early. So this is the complexity of this stage in development, is that the teenager is now becoming very aware of everybody's opinion of them and really starts to care about all this social, how they're being kind of socially scored by their peers, and at the same time their body's changing dramatically. And so at times, especially early in the adolescent's development, there's a lot of questioning, a lot of uncertainty, this is where we see a lot of the development of things that develop into body issues, into self-esteem, and all these kind of identity-related issues. All right, but part of understanding that is understanding that they're going through the biggest developmental change in their life besides, those first couple of years. They're going through this massive physical, cognitive transformation, while also maybe going to high school for the first time and being around peers and dating for the first time. And it's no wonder that adolescence can be classified as storms and stress. Adolescents who mature earlier or later than their peers report perceiving themselves differently. So what do I mean by that? It's like people that either experience puberty early or late. We're going to talk just for a second about how that kind of affects how they see themselves, and that actually is different depending on which gender we're talking about. Early maturing boys tend to perceive themselves more positively, tend to have more success in their peer relations. Now, this is kind of interesting though. So, and again, just speaks to the complexity of the human experience. Boys that mature earlier tend to do well in the moment. So they tend to do well, say for example, they mature earlier and then their high school experiences may be really positive, but they tend to underperform compared to kids that developed later in terms of how they are way down the road, almost as if that early development allowed them to not have to develop certain skills they would need later, right? This is why we get this seemingly contradictory idea that early maturing boys perceive themselves more positively, they have more successful peer relations, but then the later maturing boys in their 30s have a stronger sense of identity than these earlier maturing boys. Right, so kind of the difference between short-term and long-term effect. And that we actually see for girls that there's a lot of girls that develop early or go through their maturation early because of a lot of societal pressures associated with that, and a whole bunch of things that would be a whole It'd be interesting to have some of your feedback on some of this, especially in like a podcast format or something like that. There's all kinds of pressures, not even to mention things like media and social media, but that pressure girls, and it seems like this early maturation is linked with things like early smoking and alcohol use and depression and eating disorders and all these kind of things that you fear a bit as a parent, or not a bit, a lot, right? And that it's interesting to why this is the case and what social factors are related to that, and how maybe this emerging social media world is playing into this. And yeah, I think there's, if especially if this was like an in-person class, there'd be a ton of interesting areas of discussion there. Now, and that just in connection to the last point I made, I said, if this was an in-person class, we could have some discussion. And I do want to try to think a little bit about, for next term or whatever, how to incorporate a little more interactiveness into my course. But for now we're in the last week. It's not the time to change up stuff. But I want to make this point now here. So if you look at this image for a second, I want to make this point that what's really interesting about the teenage years is this pruning that's happening. Okay, so think about pruning, like pruning a bonsai tree, and that I'm just going to read this. Recall that nearly twice as many synaptic connections are made as we will ever use. Right? So we have more connections than we ever use. And the connections that we do have get strengthened and survived, while the unused ones get replaced by other pathways or disappear over time. In the language of neuroscience, we'd say that these connections are pruned. As a result of this pruning, by the end of adolescence, individuals have fewer, more selective, and more effective neuronal connections than they did as children. This pruning indicates that the activities in which adolescents choose to engage and not engage in influence which neural connections will be strengthened and which will disappear. So now let's look at these different brain parts for a sec. So using an fMRI, or so a functional magnetic reasoning imagery, so being able to see the processing of the brain, scientists have discovered that the adolescent brain undergoes significant structural changes. The corpus callosum, which is sort of like, you can view it as kind of like the power cord between the two hemispheres, but it's really like a nerve fiber cord, right? So the corpus callosum, where nerve fibers connect to brain's left and right hemispheres, that during adolescence that thickens, it literally gets thicker, and that's related to the adolescent's improved ability to process information. So it's kind of interesting, like earlier in the course we talked about how the prefrontal cortex we talked about the prefrontal cortex, but adolescence is also the time where we see the emergence of more adult sexuality, and we see this important factor of trying to regulate some of these emerging sexual feelings while also trying to form a sexual identity is something that's in a lot of ways definitional of these teenage years. And it's this process of constructing this or developing this sexual identity that involves things like what you're interested in, and how you behave in those situations, and even things like sexual orientation, and this experimentation with these new experiences that the adolescent may not be emotionally prepared for, that we see earlier activity in low-income areas. And an interesting point I wanted to mention here is that one of the studies that it goes into depth about in the textbook is how adolescent males who play sports tend to engage in riskier sexual activity earlier, whereas adolescent females who play sports actually show the reverse effect. So that would be a really interesting area of study, or to do a paper about, or something like that, like why there's such a gender distinction. Adolescent pregnancy creates health risks for both baby and the mother. Infants born to adolescent mothers are more likely to have a low birth weight, which is a prominent factor in infant mortality, as well as having other neurological problems and an increased chance of other types of childhood illnesses. Adolescent mothers are more likely to be depressed and more likely to drop out of school than their peers. Although many adolescent mothers may resume their education later in life, they generally never catch up economically with women who postpone childbearing until their 20s. Now, in terms of talking to teens about this kind of stuff and why developmental psychologists would encourage things like health classes in high schools where you talk about some of this stuff, is because, well, some people would argue, like, well, do you want to be talking about this with teens? Like, doesn't that make them more likely to, being exposed to these ideas, doesn't that increase the frequency or the likelihood of them engaging in these activities earlier? But the research actually shows that education programs that emphasize contraceptive knowledge and basically increase kids' tool set in how to respond safely and responsibly actually don't increase incidences of early sexual intercourse, and actually tend to reduce risk of adolescent pregnancy and transmission of sexually transmitted infections. So adolescent health is an important subtopic in this presentation because a lot of the behavioral patterns that get established in adolescence have long-lasting effects, whether we're talking about things like obesity, all right, whether we're talking about things like establishing healthy eating and healthy nutrition and healthy exercise patterns, that we see that it's all, well, like early obesity is on the increase and has long-term health implications. Positive outcomes of exercise in adolescence are things like reduced triglyceride levels, lower blood pressure levels, lower incidences of diabetes. Adolescent exercise is associated with, the way that they're parented, their relationships, how much screen time they have. So what I'm saying here is so much of their health is this functional interplay relationship between kind of their social world, their physical development, their cognitive and emotional development, their personality, their family structure, their media use. Evidence, so I'm going to go a little bit more on this sleep idea. This idea that evidence suggests that most adolescents actually get less sleep than they need. Even though we would think of teens as a group that sleeps a lot, and they do. They probably sleep second only to infants, right? But let me read this to you. A 2012 position paper released by the Canadian Sleep Society noted two key characteristics of sleep. So they said there's these two main characteristics of sleep. Number one, the amount that you sleep. But number two, the timing of the rhythms, the circadian rhythms of your sleep. They provide abundant evidence that most adolescents get less sleep than they need, and that their circadian rhythm differs from that of children and adults, a shift that's not taken into account in most school districts. Adolescents will sleep an average of 9 hours and 25 minutes a night when given an opportunity. Most get considerably less, though, than 9 hours of sleep. However, especially during the week, this shortfall creates a sleep deficit which adolescents often attempt to make up on the weekend. In addition to needing more sleep, adolescents experience a shift in their circadian rhythm. Left alone, they'd go to bed much later than younger children and adults. Adolescents' biological clock undergoes a shift as they get older, delaying their period of wakefulness by about an hour. A delay in the nightly release of their sleep-inducing hormone melatonin, which is produced in the brain's pineal gland, seems to underlie this shift. Melatonin is secreted at about 9:30 p.m. in younger children and approximately an hour later in adolescents. So, and this is a tough conversation in a lot of ways, but it's important to also touch on this idea of how some of these behaviorals towards things like whether we're talking about substance use or eating disorders and the role of parental monitoring, and that we actually find that parental monitoring, or basically parents being involved and concerned and asking questions and trying to stay involved as much as they can with their kids, has been linked to lower incidences of behavioral problems in adolescence, including things like substance abuse. And the research is pretty clear that the strongest predictor of substance use is peer group. Right now, peer group often gets this negative rap in terms of this negative influence. Now, peer groups can also be a very positive thing, right? If you're around people that encourage you to stay active and do healthy things and be interested in interesting things and be a good person, then that peer pressure is a very positive thing. So it completely depends on who the peers are. And also during this adolescent time period, if we're talking about adolescent health, one area where we see a lot of teens struggle is around eating disorders. And there's I want to just distinguish between anorexia nervosa, which is an eating disorder that involves this relentless pursuit of thinness, and bulimia nervosa, which is an eating disorder where the individual consistently follows up a binge and purge pattern. So again, it's like, how does that all link with the body image stuff we've been talking about? It's so complex, and I want to kind of lay some of the groundwork today, and then in the next course I want to really get into this idea of how we're supposed to take all of this and become like functioning adults, right? And like, I want to actually take that point I just randomly said, I want to actually take that really seriously in that next course. Is how do we not just understand what developmental psychology has to teach about adulthood, but functionalize and operationalize it. Okay, so anyways, that's just my plan going forward. Formal operational thought is more abstract than concrete operational thought. Adolescents are no longer limited to actual concrete experiences as anchors to their thoughts. They can start to conjure up make-believe situations. They can start to think of more abstract propositions. They can even think of events that are purely hypothetical and try to reason logically about them. They have this increased So then as the adolescent's cognition continues developing, there's this emergence of what's called hypothetical deductive reasoning. So again, that's one of those things that sounds like a ton, but when you sort of break down what that's really saying, it's saying, you know what hypothetical means? It means like talking about a situation that may or may not exist, a hypothetical situation. And reasoning means explaining the reason something is the way it is. And then deduction means this idea of, okay, something's happening and we're trying to explain what's causing that, and there's all these potential things that are causing it, and through trial and error we kind of figure out, okay, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, and we kind of start zoning in and focusing in on what the actual problem might be. That's called deduction. It's the opposite of inductive. But basically it just means this idea of this hypothetical deductive reasoning, that the adolescent is beginning to think more like a scientist, starting to be able to devise plans to solve problems and systematically test solutions. That's what deduction is. So another aspect of this formal operational period is this notion of adolescent egocentrism. So now just think about, again, you've heard this, we've talked about this term before in the course, of egocentrism, or ego being this part of me that's Mike, or this part of me that I self-identify as, and seeing things from that, or like it's, you know, we say in our common culture, we say like the person's self-centered, and it's kind of means that you're kind of seeing everything and how it relates to you, and that's something that's almost a natural, predictable stage that adolescents go through. And the term for that is this adolescent egocentrism, this heightened sense of self. And David Elkind, the person that coined this term, talked about this having two components, these two things we're going to talk about next. This idea of an imaginary audience and this idea of a personal fable. So I want you to be able to distinguish between these terms. So this is an interesting idea, and it's the notion that as the teenager, well, as the person is going through their teenage years, they have this belief that others are as interested in them as they are in themselves, that there's this like imaginary audience watching them. Again, it's not like if you ask them they actually think that. I'm not trying to say that all teenagers are delusional, but we all, if we're being completely honest, had a little bit of that feeling of like at a certain point that we're almost like the star in our own movie, or you know, that now another way this could come up is like the kid gets a new coat for Christmas, but they don't like the coat because they don't think their friends are going to like it. And it's like that awareness of that like vague social group that's not here and what they're going to think. It's like this audience starts to almost travel with the kid or with the teen. And that might be linked to some attention-seeking behavior. This imaginary audience is the adolescent's belief that others are as interested in them as they are in themselves. Adolescents can sense that they're on stage almost in early adolescence, believing that they're the main actors and all others are the audience, and that this imaginary audience can be very discerning for parents who go through this rapid change of at first being like almost the child's hero to becoming somebody that's like embarrassing to them. All suddenly the adolescent wants to walk separately in the mall and starts being critical of everything from a parent's wardrobe to their behavior. The next aspect is this development of a personal fable, or the part of the adolescent egocentrism that's involved in this unique sense, or this sense of being unique or personally invincible. You know, that the classic quote associated with this is, "No one understands me, especially my parents. They have no idea what I'm feeling." Adolescents have this sense of personal uniqueness that makes it feel like no one can understand how they really feel. As a part of their effort to retain a sense of personal uniqueness, they might even craft a story of their self that's filled with fantasy and aspects can be far removed from reality. So these personal stories are fables. So Deanna Cohen, so this is some research from 2009, but well-known research, Deanna Cohen, discussed some important characteristics of adolescent information processing and thinking. So Kuhn's going to talk about this from like a cognitive perspective. Kuhn argues that the large individual differences in cognitive levels are achieved during late childhood and adolescence, in contrast with the largely universal cognitive levels that young children attain. So let me say that again and just say this point, and then I'll read that again. Because what she's basically saying is, okay, during childhood, the developments that kids go through are relatively similar. But in adolescence and adulthood, we start to see these major differences between people. So I'll read that again. Kuhn argues that large individual differences in cognitive levels are achieved during late childhood and adolescence, in contrast with the largely universal cognitive levels that young children attain. This variability supports the argument that adolescents are producers of their own development to a greater extent than are children. That is, adolescents are more likely than children to initiate changes in their thinking rather than depending on others, such as parents and teachers, to direct their thinking. Kuhn argues that the most important cognitive change in adolescence is improvements in their executive function, an umbrella term that consists of a number of higher-level cognitive processes linked to the development of the prefrontal cortex. Executive function involves managing one's thoughts to engage in goal-oriented behavior and to exercise self-control. Cognitive control involves executive control of a number of areas, including things like controlling how much you're paying attention to, being able to resist things like distraction, being cognitively flexible. Cognitive control continues to increase in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Controlling attention is a key aspect of learning and thinking in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Distraction that can interfere with attention comes from the external environment, or can come also from intrusive distractions. So distractions coming from inside. This can be things like worry, self-doubt, intense emotions. The teenager's also going through this thing that's, and we're going to get into this more next term. It seems weird to say, but for those of you taking the second part of this, we're going to get into this idea of the social world of high school and how all this stuff we're talking about is occurring within a super complex social world also. And there's this idea I want you to know, this idea of the top dog phenomena of, when you're in grade 8 in your grade school, you're the coolest group of kids on school, you're the biggest, you've been around the longest, you know everything, and then you go to high school and all of a sudden now you're the smallest and you've went back to the bottom of the pecking order. These high schools are also bigger, they're more bureaucratic, they're more impersonal than maybe your junior high school was. The content might not seem as specifically tailored. You're all of a sudden in these complex peer group cultures. And we see that some people don't respond well to that, and we see that there's a statistically significant amount of people that drop out, and a lot of the males that drop out, if you ask them why, it's related to this idea of they didn't find that they were learning things that were relevant to them, and they didn't feel like they were a good fit, and the attraction to start working and make some money was there, and that's what pulled them away. And oftentimes for young women, it's related to things around the family. Okay, so we're going to get into a lot more of those personality, social, emotional dynamics associated with adolescence when we pick this topic back up after the Christmas break. Again, in the second half of this course, lecture series, YouTube channel. You NIPSing students, I love doing this. I hope that you enjoyed this course. This is kind of my last slide. And I'm going to actually do like a couple more that's just a quick overview, but I hope this has been a fun ride and that you've enjoyed this course and learned a few things. And I know that when maybe I should do my final not goodbye, but my end of term kind of messages I'll do in a different video, but anyways, it's been fun doing this class. I've enjoyed making lectures like this. It's been pretty fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Okay, anyways, enough, Mike. Okay, how you want to be? How sappy am I gonna be here? Okay, next slide. Okay, lightning final review time. I'm just gonna fire through some of these points. You don't have to write any of this down. If you've been taking notes, you already have this. Sometimes in slightly different formats. Many stereotypes of adolescence are too negative. Yes, there's a lot of things going on, but to really understand the complexity of this, we need to understand how much is happening cognitively, physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. All right, and this idea that this is this probably after the first few years, like that early infancy period, the most complex developmental period. That we see this puberty, and puberty has determinants including things like nutrition and health and heredity. We see that the hormonal changes occurring in puberty are substantial. Puberty occurs approximately 2 years earlier, again on average, for girls than for boys. Individual variation in pubertal changes is substantial. Adolescents show more considerable interest in their body image, with girls having a more negative body image in general than boys. And this idea that early maturing girls are vulnerable to a number of risks. Number 3, changes in the brain during adolescence involves the thickening of the corpus callosum, that cord that connects the two hemispheres. And this gap in maturation between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So this fact that, if you're looking at what's actually happening in the brain during puberty, there's kind of these two main things. One is that connection piece, the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres is getting thicker. And then the other thing is that's important to keep in mind is the emotional center, the amygdala, the limbic system is getting fully developed, and the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet. Number 4, adolescence is a time of sexual exploitation and sexual experimentation. Or the first experiences of these early sexual activities are associated with a variety of negative outcomes if they happen too early. Adolescence is a critical juncture in health. And one of the reasons we talked about that is because of establishment of patterns. We talked about things like sleep. Many adolescents stay up later than when they were children and they actually get less sleep than they need, even though they get numbers-wise a lot of sleep. Although drug use in adolescence has declined in recent years, it's still a major concern. We didn't get too deep into that, but eating disorders have increased in adolescence, with a substantial increase in the percentage of adolescents who are overweight. 2 eating disorders that often emerge in adolescence are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And it's interesting that nervosa is a part of both of those words. The anxiety around it, obviously the word nerves is there. In Piaget's formal operational stage, thought is more abstract, idealistic, and logical than during the concrete operational stage, or the stage before that, kind of childhood. However, many adolescents, even adults, are not at what Piaget would say is that final stage. So there's adults that haven't reached Piaget's final stage. Adolescent egocentrism, which involves a heightening sense of consciousness, self-consciousness, reflects another cognitive change in adolescence, in addition to Piaget's description of the 3 cognitive changes, like pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Changes in information processing in adolescence are mainly reflected in improved executive functioning, which is related to these things like cognitive control and decision making. All right, almost there. Number 12, the transition to middle or junior high school is often stressful. One of the sources of stress is this move from being the top dog at the grade school to the lowest position at the high school. The overall high school dropout rate in Canada has declined considerably over the last 2 decades, but the dropout rate for Indigenous youth remains really high. Service learning we didn't talk too much about, but service learning is just basically this idea that, I'm not sure in the North Bay area, but around Kitchener it's like this too, where like the high school students have to do a certain amount of hours of community service, and that that's considered like an important part of their social emotional development. So again, just service learning just means that idea of like having community service as part of their high school experience. So thanks for watching this Chapter 7 presentation. I hope you learned a few things, and good luck on the quiz. By the time you see this, the quiz will be up. And by the time you've done that quiz, then you've done all the quizzes. If you've done your Giants of Psychology and your key concepts. And then last week I sent out that document for the final test, or the final exam, right, where you have to answer a couple of the questions. Or actually, sorry, where you just answer one question. Okay, so we're basically there. We just need to work hard for the next little bit and get over the finish line, okay? I'll talk to you soon, and again, thanks for being an awesome class this year. Cheers.